Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Teaching About 9/11 webinar. I'm David Olson, the Director of Education for Retro Report. I'm co-hosting this evening with Vicky Pasquantonio, the education producer at PBS NewsHour Extra, along with our very special guest, Dr. Jeremy Stoddard of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I want to go ahead and share my screen here. So as you join us this evening, make sure you tell us where you are joining us from, and then we have a couple poll questions for you to answer as well. So just by way of introductions, like I said, my name is David Olson, Director of Education at Retro Report. Feel free after the event tonight or anytime moving forward to reach out to me via email at dolson@retroreport.com or connect with me on Twitter at David John Olson. Like I said, joining me this evening are Vicky Pasquantonio, part of a venerated news institution of PBS NewsHour. Vicky is in charge of their education arm there. And Dr. Jeremy Stoddard, who is the professor and chair of the secondary education program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So as we get started here tonight, we're going to begin with Dr. Stoddard, who's going to introduce us to some of the materials that he has put together through a grant for the Teaching with Primary Sources grant from the Library of Congress.
All right, so what I'm going to talk about today a little bit is some research that we've done on basically how 9/11's been integrated into curriculum and now into classrooms since about 2003. And I'm going to do this because it sets up the project that Dave had introduced a little bit, and that essentially we used it, especially this last survey that I'm going to talk about, to really inform a project that basically is creating a bunch of sets for teachers like you to use to teach about 9/11. Do you want to go to the next one, Dave? So just really briefly, we started in 2003 with curriculum that were produced to teach about the first anniversary after 9/11. And so all sorts of groups came out with curriculum to teach about the events. And what we were really interested in was, what was the story of 9/11 essentially going to become? What were some of the themes that emerged from these curriculums? Everybody from, I think Justice Scalia, U.S. Supreme Court Justice, was part of one. There were celebrities that were part of different curriculum. It was really sort of all over the place, and some themes started to emerge. Then we got interested in looking at, well, how's it going to be included in textbooks? So we started in 2005 looking at textbooks, and then at the next edition in 2010. And then finally, for those of you outside the US, these are state academic standards. So each state in the US has their own set of standards. We started to look at how it's included there. And then finally, in late 2018, we did a survey of teachers across the US, and we had over 1,000 teachers complete. And I'm going to give you a little bit of the highlights of these things here, and then introduce you to sort of the product that came from it. We'll go to the next one, Dave. All right, so the big themes from the early studies were centered around the fact that teachers and curriculum producers assumed that everyone had witnessed the events. And so what we actually saw was an actual lack of detail of what actually happened, because it was assumed people knew. 9/11 as this shocking, unprecedented attack against the US, and unexpected in many ways, it was sort of told as, and very nationalistic. So the image here that you see showed up in almost every textbook that we looked at in Curriculum Source. It's got the Iwo Jima sort of battle look. It's been shown everywhere, so it's become very iconic in terms of the firemen and the flag and the rubble. There's also a lot of conceptual confusion, meaning they were using a definition of terrorism in a lot of these textbooks that didn't even match the examples of terrorism that they were using in the narrative text. And one of the other things that we saw around terrorism was almost all of the examples after 9/11 become Muslim-related terrorist incidences versus domestic incidences in the US or anti-government groups. And then finally, especially early on, there was little or no controversy included in the textbook. So even around the invasion of Iraq in 2003, 2004, some of the Patriot Act issues, those don't actually get acknowledged as being controversial until much later. Dave? All right, so then the next thing we looked at is state standards, and we want to know, is it being included or not, and sort of how? And so what we saw was, now you have to take standards as some of them don't include specific events, so that's why some of them don't include it. But basically we have pretty good coverage, 70% roughly of states either had terrorism or 9/11 specifically included in their standards. So that tells you sort of at this moment going into now 2017, it's becoming sort of formally a part of the American curriculum across many, many states. How it was included varied really widely. There were only 2 or 3 states, again, that included domestic terrorism as an example, versus other forms of terrorism. And again, really heavily associating terrorism with Muslim extremist groups. All right, Dave? All right, and so then we come to the survey. Again, it was over 1,000 teachers, and we started to look at what are we seeing almost 20 years later now about how 9/11 is being taught in US classrooms. And what we're seeing is for a lot of teachers, it hasn't changed all that much in that teachers are still largely teaching it on the day of the anniversary because they think it's important to include, and also because it doesn't appear in their curriculum maybe until very late in the year. So they want to include it on the day of, but a lot of it is still focused on, the reason I have the image from the NBC Today show there is a lot of people are still using footage of the day, documentaries, things to try to get across to students sort of how shocking this was, and to sort of simulate in a way how many Americans and people around the globe actually witnessed the events, which was through a TV screen, unless you were in one of the regions directly affected. So we're seeing still a lot of focus on sort of that shock of the day, the heroism, the nationalism. But what teachers also reported was they have students coming in now because none of these students were largely alive at the time. They know very little about the events or even have a lot of misinformation. And so one thing it'll be interesting to hear from all of you is if you're also seeing sort of conspiracy theories coming into the classroom or just really a sort of misunderstanding of the events. And at the time we did this survey, also a lot of rise of anti-Muslim sentiment because it was the timing right around when the US was proposing a ban on people coming from predominantly Muslim countries. Finally, we were seeing a collective memory split where we had a lot of older teachers who wanted to continue to sort of share that collective memory, that same nationalistic story with students and memorialize the events, whereas other teachers wanted their students to really look more critically at how it was a significant event that has impacted their lives, especially around things like surveillance and the change in national security, the terrorism threat levels, things that they wouldn't have known because they weren't alive before 9/11. And so finally, we want to really look at how is this getting sort of becoming the official story of 9/11? And that's one of the things that we want to look at sort of beyond 20. All right, Dave. So I'm just going to show you a little bit. So what we did is one of the questions we asked the teachers, and then when we did the interviews was, what do you want to be able to do a better job with this? What are the types of resources or things that you want? Knowing that the textbooks haven't radically changed much and they don't include a lot. It's very short segment, again, sort of fitting that official story. And so we've created a set of resources that, Dave, can you drop the link in the chat? If you want to peruse sort of while we're chatting here, this is a set of resources around certain themes that were identified by teachers. We also really wanted to emphasize what we're looking at in terms of some of the essentially newer types of primary sources that exist sort of in the last 20 years, which are things like podcasts, things like infographics, things like some social media posts, possibly memes, right? These are all primary sources that aren't always included in sort of your typical history class. News footage is another one. We want people to start to look at these as essentially primary artifacts, telling us something about the context of the time, where it came from, who made it, how it was received at the time even. So those are some of the things that we really started working on. Dave, do you want to go to the next one? And so just to sort of as a guide here, there's 3 sections. One of them is actually a research section. So if you're interested in some of the work we've done, the report I was just drawing from is actually in there. You can download it. All of this should be accessible from wherever you are. And if it isn't, email me and I'll make sure you get it. And so what we included were sets of teaching guides. These are sort of similar to some of the National Archives sets that they have, which give you some things that you can adapt, pull questions from, things to engage critically with some of these sources, and especially teaching both sort of engaging with the content, but also the form. So what do we want kids to know about a podcast as a primary source that's different from a letter or a photograph or something else, right? That they've been heavily produced, that they've been made for a particular sort of emotional appeal, right? All these things that we want them to understand about the nature of the form itself. So these are all included to go along with the primary sources that we have. And then do you want to go to the next one, Dave? And then for each of the topic sets that we have, which include the Soviet-Afghan War, intelligence failure around the CIA and FBI. And if you were ever in the FBI museum, now they've changed it. But since 9/11, it was really this ode to what they saw as an internal failure. And it was remarkable in the FBI building. They had one of the cars that the terrorists left at the airport. They had all these artifacts in this main lobbyway that the FBI agents would be walking through as sort of a reminder, essentially, of what they saw as a grave failure on their part. Then we've got archives of the day of. We've got things that are especially bringing in Muslim and Arab American perspectives, which we think is really key to understanding it today, since these things are rising back up. The TSA, which is a sort of uniquely American phenomenon in terms of the airport security. They even made some infographics explaining security at the time. And then some of the veterans' perspectives, which is another thing teachers really wanted. All right, Dave, you want to go to the next one? I'm just going to give you one little quick example. So this is one of the examples from our Afghan war set of sources, and it's a CIA memo from 1989. And so I think one of the things that we found with teachers and what they were telling us is there isn't always the engagement in the lead up, the causes of the events going into 9/11 that there could be. And the long history of the US and the Middle East and other countries is one of those key facets of it. And so the arming of the Mujahideen by the US and the CIA's role in helping them in the 1980s, and then basically leaving them, and its ties then to the development of the Taliban, the development of Al-Qaeda, and then other aspects that lead essentially to, to some degree lead to 9/11. One of the things that's really fascinating, if you go back and look at the Today Show coverage or one of the other newscasts, but that's the one I looked at, within an hour and a half, they have Osama bin Laden's picture up with a bullseye on it and talking about that he's hiding in Afghanistan. So on one hand, we've got this shocking, unexpected attack, and it wasn't really unexpected. It was unexpected that it hit the World Trade Center in New York, but they knew of Osama bin Laden 2 weeks before. They had intelligence that they were expecting an attack. And this sort of gets dropped out of the story sometimes in terms of understanding the events leading up to 9/11, including the 93 Trade Center bombing that had happened previously by Al-Qaeda. But if you look at this source in particular, there's a couple of really interesting things that they start to identify as potential issues if the US disengages completely from the Mujahideen, who the basically just means fighter or warrior in Afghanistan. And one of them, if you notice the bottom one, it says it could leave the Mujahideen feeling betrayed and risk an eventual anti-American government in Afghanistan, right? So even back in the 1980s, they're recognizing that by leaving, because they no longer felt their presence was necessary because they had, driven the Soviet Union out as part of the Cold War, even though they had these lessons here, this is sort of the trail of the Cold War and imperialism around the world, is that you're creating groups, engaging them in particular actions, in this case against the Soviet Union, arming them, helping train them, giving them intelligence, all of these things, and then basically abandoning them when you don't need them anymore. And so it starts to give you some insights of, again, sort of the lead up and role that the US played even well before 9/11 in Afghanistan. And today, it could be compared to what's going on today in terms of the US and other countries sort of evacuating personnel and leaving Afghanistan. Again, it could be a great comparison as you go into school these next couple of weeks. So that's just one example. There's lots of sources there. And we're going to keep adding to them as teachers sort of show us great ones that they're using. In fact, we'll have a big update here in in another week or so. And so please come back and look and let us know if you have questions or if you have anything else to add. And if there's questions, you can pop them in the chat too, and I can answer as Dave takes over here.
And one of the things I'll say is everyone who's registered for our webinar tonight, I'll be sending a follow-up email tomorrow with the entire presentation here, all of the links, that sort of thing. So if you're worried about clicking on stuff and exploring now, don't be. We got you. We'll make sure you have all the resources that we're going over tonight. So like I said, I'm David Olson. I am the newly minted Director of Education at Retro Report. I'm 6 weeks into the job now and very much enjoying it. But not that long ago, even last June, I was where the vast majority of you are as a classroom teacher. I spent the last decade plus as a high school social studies history, government, criminal justice teacher at a large public high school in Madison, Wisconsin. And as Carrie put in there, as there being a department chair, I abandoned that duty as well when I jumped ship to the new job. So I'm really excited about the new organization that I'm working with, Retro Report. And in part, I'm really excited about it because they do amazing work. So Retro Report is if you haven't heard of them, I know we have some fans already. Retro Report is a nonprofit journalism organization. Their focus is really on short form documentary films and ones that connect the past and the present. They are very good storytellers. They are very good investigative journalists, and they do a really good job of following up on news stories of the past and saying, here's something that's happening right now. What sort of history do we need to know to understand these things? And Retro Report, we've been around for almost a decade now in total, and their library is over 250 films. Their complete library is available on their website, entirely free. All of the short films you can use in whatever way you'd like in your classroom. And in part of why they hired a director of education is we're seeking to do more outreach with teachers, to find more ways to make what we do more accessible to all of you. So we have a growing collection of lesson plans, activities, things like that. So my job for the foreseeable future is to help create those resources, help to reach out to teachers and make those connections. So just like Jeremy said, much more to come on his website with some of these resources, and keep following Retro Report because we have much more to come as we continue to create wonderful films and resources. So one of the places we did this is we have two brand new films connected with September 11th and the War on Terror. So what we did was we took those two films, we took two other films that were already in our library, and we created some resources to go with them. So we have a Teaching About 9/11 collection. The bit.ly down here will take you there, but otherwise, again, we'll send this out and you can find it here. In total, this resource collection, there are 4 original films. One of the other things I really love about Retro Report is the vast majority of their films are in that 8 to 12 minute range. Really good for use in the classroom, right? I am sure there are plenty of you in this Zoom session tonight who have found, what they thought was the perfect film, and it was an hour and a half, and they go, oh man, am I going to take 2, 3, maybe 4 days if I want to stop and ask questions and work with this? So the Retro Report videos, due to their length, really hit that sweet spot of being able to be used well in the classroom. So we've got 4 films. Each of these films has a complete lesson plan and student activity to go with them. So each of the lesson plans and the activities, I created them in Google Docs. So you can go, it's a view-only Google Doc. Go ahead and make a copy, edit whatever you would like on there. Steal what you want, change what you want, make it your own, make it work for your classroom. This is one of those things that as a teacher, I would gather resources from all sorts of different organizations, and almost never did I take a lesson plan and use it exactly as is. So when I'm creating lesson plans for Retro Report, part of my goal is to make them as user-friendly for educators as possible. So I think Google Docs is a good way to do that, easier for you to cut and paste and make changes. We also, in addition to the 4 films and the lessons, we also have an interactive timeline that traces sort of the public debate over torture, right? This post 9/11 period where we began to get wind of potential uses of torture by the CIA, by contractors, by people associated with the military. And then there was this debate about, well, is it torture or Is it enhanced interrogation techniques? And what really is the difference between those? So the goal here was to follow this very public debate over a period of years and figure out what are some of the key points along that timeline. So there's an activity that goes along with that as well. So these activities range from investigating primary sources. In fact, part of the extra resources I used, I took right from Jeremy's collections of different resources. Some of the TV archives, some of the interview archives and artifacts. He has really great stuff. It's definitely worth exploring. I also created one that has a structured academic controversy. So if you're unfamiliar with that, it's sort of in the mode of a Socratic seminar, but really the goal there is within a small group to have students work towards consensus. So we did that one with the film that we have that traces the 20-year arc of the war in Afghanistan and looks at it from today's perspective of, is withdrawing from Afghanistan the right thing to do? So you have pairs of students who each investigate one side of that argument, work together to sort of jigsaw and explain to the other pair. And then the four of them as a group, their job is to try to reach consensus. How together, what can they agree on what should the outcome be? What decision should the United States have made or make going forward? So there's a pretty wide variety of activities. I really hope you check out the resource collection. One of the things I asked the Retro Report folks to do, since at the end of the day, they're filmmakers, was I said, you have these two great films. They're each in that like 11-minute range. I said, I can't take 22 minutes of a webinar that I'm co-hosting with two other folks. Can you smush them together for me and give me like a mini trailer for both of them? So what I'm going to show you now is about a 6-minute version where you're going to get a taste of each of the two newest films in the collection. So the first one you'll see is called 9/11 Heroes. It actually, there's firsthand accounts and interviews with some New York Police Department officers who went in to one of the World Trade Center towers, the second one to collapse. They were in the collapse and eventually made it out. And then the second film is the one that traces the war in Afghanistan. So I'm going to show you this film. And again, the full versions are available on our website with activities and lessons to go with it.
This just in, you were looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there.
A plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center here in New York City.
We don't know anything more than that. We don't know if it was a commercial aircraft.
Oh my God, another plane has just hit. It hit another building, flew right into the middle of it.
The building's exploding right now. You got people running up the street.
Sean, it's me. I just wanted to let you know I love you, and I'm stuck in this building in New York. I just wanted you to know that I love you always.
I think we have a terrorist act of proportions that we cannot begin to imagine at this juncture.
If a popular novelist sat down and wrote a novel, people wouldn't buy this book because it would be so outrageous. This could never happen.
I don't know what to tell young people about that day. I know when I die, the first thing I'm going to ask St. Peter is like, hey, what happened? How did this happen? Because I still have questions. That was my day off. It was a beautiful day, really beautiful blue skies.
It was going to be the morning of the mayoral primaries. They switched me to do election duty that day.
Like every other morning, we were sitting around the table just going over what was going on with the kids, with the family.
I was in my bathroom taking a shower, and I had a window that faced south, and I heard what I thought was an explosion.
At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the World Trade Center North Tower, Building 1. It was one of 4 planes hijacked by 19 al-Qaeda terrorists that day. At first, it seemed a tragic accident, an airplane off course.
As I'm watching this, trying to figure out, do I have to go to work? The second plane hit, and I saw it on TV. And that was it.
And all I seen was this huge fireball coming out of Tower 2, out of the South Tower. And for a second, I didn't know what it was. I thought maybe just the building blew up.
I ran downstairs, and I'm looking south, and both towers are on fire. And it was stunning.
With the second catastrophic strike, it became clear that the country was under attack. New York City mounted its largest rescue effort in history, dispatching more than 2,000 firefighters, medical workers, and police officers to Lower Manhattan.
Here's the beginning of the second film.
The president, he has to see me in his office on Air Force One. The president looked me in the eye and he said, "Michael, who did this?" I told the president that I would bet my children's future that Al-Qaeda was responsible for this attack.
Within hours, evidence surfaced that Al-Qaeda, a multinational terrorist organization headed by the Islamic fundamentalist Osama bin Laden, had committed the attacks. The group was being given safe haven in Afghanistan by the Taliban regime.
The president's inclination was to hit back and hit back hard.
I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people...
So the president decided to go to war.
And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
We had to go to Afghanistan. There's no question in any of our minds. It's a war of necessity. We had to go after Al-Qaeda. We had to kill them. We had to get them out. And we had to pursue them to the ends of the earth.
I think the military and the national security apparatus thought they could win. And I think that they also wanted to believe that because they had invested so much. People had died, and they didn't want them to die in vain.
2011, bin Laden is now dead. Why was it so hard to de-escalate?
Jeffrey Eggers was on President Obama's National Security Council. He says that the goal, since 9/11, to make sure Afghanistan would never again be a safe haven for terrorists, had become a recipe for endless war.
We will forever prevent the conditions that led to such an attack.
Danger close.
And if you define it that way, when are you finished?
Go! Come on, come on, come on!
Though the surge failed to push back the Taliban, the U.S. drew down troop levels, even as doubts were growing that Afghan forces would be able to defend the country. In 2021, President Biden, the fourth president to preside over the war, announced that he would withdraw U.S. troops, a plan set in motion by his predecessor, Donald Trump.
Nobody should have any doubts. We lost the war in Afghanistan.
And we were cleared to cross.
It wasn't a peace agreement, it was a withdrawal agreement. The agreement was essentially, as we withdraw, don't attack us.
As the U.S. leaves Afghanistan, the Taliban is taking over again, having quickly overrun the Afghan army, which the U.S. spent more than $80 billion to train and equip.
The Taliban are out in full force, and their Islamist rule is already coming back.
They can use this as a recruiting tool. They are now the champions of the jihadi movement because they pushed out the United States.
And U.S. officials are reflecting on the beginning of the war, 20 years after 9/11.
More people should have thought about endless war, not just in Congress, but in the State Department, in Defense Department, CIA, and elsewhere, in the White House, that the recipe of using military means to go after terrorism was just going to get us into one fight after another after another. One can only hope that Americans of the new generation will think about this.
All right. So hopefully that gave you a bit of a taste here of the two new films that Retro Report has produced. So that was the two smashed together here. Yep, there we go. So if you go to the Teaching About 9/11 resources page, this is what it looks like here. What you will find are the 4 films. So this is the 9/11 Heroes page. Under each of them, you'll find the lesson plan. This is the teacher-facing document that tells you, here's what you'll have students do, here's what resources you'll need, how long it might take, the standards, the sort of national-ish standards that it applies to, and then the student activity here. So you can take a look. They'll both pop up as Google Docs, and so you can take a look and check those out. So here's this first one, then the student activity here. I designed these so that if you want to do this entire lesson, you can make a copy. You can put this right into Google Classroom. You can print these out. You can do it in whatever way makes the most sense for your classroom. But for each of these, it'll give a little bit of background and objective, and then get right into the activity that you'll have students do. So in each of these student activities, at least part of it is centered around the Retro Report film, but then all of them also involve some additional resources. So here, like the 9/11 Heroes one, this is where I connected with some of Jeremy's resources. So we have the television archive. There's a Library of Congress 9/11 archive, the archive of the museum, which breaks my heart that it's no longer open as a physical museum in Washington, D.C., but their collection of newspaper headlines from around the world after September 11th is still available. And then some artifacts from the 9/11 Memorial Museum there as well. So here, the goal of this activity is to have students sort of delve into looking at a bunch of different types of primary sources. So we have the 9/11 Heroes one. We have the Decades of War, the Afghanistan one. This is one that focuses on a structured academic controversy where they're sort of looking at multiple sides of this question. The two films that already existed in our library, one of them is about a supposed sleeper cell, a group of young Muslim men in and around Detroit, Michigan, who were falsely arrested and even convicted of conspiring to commit a terrorist attack in the United States, and it was entirely false. So this is their story, and this one, as sort of the broader picture of the activity, looks at the perspective of Muslims and Arab Americans in the United States. And then the last one, the film actually centers on the only CIA contractor ever to be prosecuted for torture for his treatment of a man in Afghanistan that actually led to the man's death. So here, that film looks at this sort of public debate about torture as it played out in our society. So, and the interactive timeline is here, and this is the one that goes with that. So you can see it'll take you through a number of different events. There are a number of videos.
It is a mean, nasty, dangerous.
So there are videos, there are documents, there's a political cartoon, there are photos, a bunch of different things. Again, primary source materials for students to analyze, to dissect, and try to make sense of what this public debate was actually about. So if you'd like some advice here, if there are those of you, if you're feeling like a forlorn Condoleezza Rice, these are from the National Archives photos that were taken immediately after September 11th here. If you're a forlorn Condoleezza Rice and wondering, well, what should I do? Here's how much time I have. I sort of have an idea of maybe how I would use this, particularly if I were teaching a US history or a civics or government course. I think the Afghanistan film in particular fits really well if you're teaching a world history or world cultures course. If you have one day, I might go, if you're using the Retro Report materials, the 9/11 Heroes or the Afghanistan film. Both of them, the activities allow for some good material for students to delve into. There's really here a mix of sort of some remembrance, but also information and investigation. If you're looking at 2 or more days, perhaps the structured academic controversy, that's, I would say, the one of these that most clearly connects to what is happening today, and something that should be of high interest to your students. And if you're looking at 3 or more days, perhaps mix and match. Maybe that's where you would work in the timeline or something like that. I think if you were using something like the sleeper cell film, that might fit in if you're teaching a more modern U.S. history class or a civics or government class. All right. So Vicki, I think this is the point where I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn it over to you. Does that sound reasonable?
Yes, it does.
All right.
All right. I'm so honored to be with all of you tonight. I'm going to make this, oops. So I just was looking at a few of the comments with how teachers are teaching it already in the classroom and the personal stories. There's some eyewitnesses. And so talk about primary sources. You are in fact primary sources yourselves. And that is remarkably powerful, I think, to students to hear that. So if you have that personal story, and it's so interesting, Jeremy, because it can't only be through that lens, clearly. But if you have that lens and you're able to kind of walk through Scott and Lisa, I know you guys were, one of you was in New York, one was in Arlington. That vulnerability is something that stays with your students forever. So I'm gonna present with remote, and let me see if this works. Okay, yeah. The 9/11 anniversary, this is on our homepage now. And I just included Retro Report as one of the resources. And I'm so glad that Retro Report has you, David. You have such a heart when it comes to history and social studies in our country. And so bravo to them for seeing your talent and your heart and your smarts. Basically, NewsHour Extra, traditional current events site in many ways. It's based on the content of the NewsHour. And so we have things like at our disposal. And this is pretty, well, it's a gift really, to have the journalists who make these resources, because they like David and Jeremy, their heart and their soul is with this issue. And this timeline on Afghanistan is very helpful. And so I just trust that you will use it with your students, because I think, let's face it, a lot of adults, gosh, I include myself, there were things I totally have forgotten that have happened in 20 years. So I would probably start out with, like, what do you notice about the timeline of events? The fact that we have 9/11, the 20th anniversary coming, days after we essentially have lost that conflict, is that is incredible. So in the spirit of current events, I cannot see teaching this without teaching what's happening in Afghanistan right now. And then I'd say, what questions do you have about specific events or decisions that were made by leadership? And I guess my brother's in the military. He served 2 tours in Iraq. I think Scott in the chat was also in the military and helped out later at the Pentagon, which he shares with his students, which again, those personal stories are incredible. While these nuts and bolts journalistic who, what, where, when, why stories, US to miss Afghanistan, May withdrawal, are essential. And some of your students want to hear those stories. That's how they learn more than maybe some of the personal narrative stuff. But I think middle and high schoolers are are going to want to hear some of the personal stuff. And so, again, here's what the politicians are saying about how the withdrawal is going in Afghanistan. And the Democrats, Jean Shaheen on here is expressing her disappointment. So this is quite not as folks expected things to go. And yet, I think probably a lot of international, like the assistant secretary in the retro report, maybe not a big shock or surprise. I'm not going to show this. I was going to show it. You really have to show this to your students. It's Joe Biden reacting to the Afghanistan papers during the PBS NewsHour presidential debate. Now it's come out that Joe Biden, he wasn't with Barack Obama on this. And now that's something he's talking about a lot more frankly. And he says as much in this answer during the debate last year. And it's very powerful. The NewsHour reporter kind of calls him on it, teach 9/11 through the lens of media literacy. How, did the journalist do a good job there or not? How would you have? She calls him out on, you're not really answering the questions about the Afghanistan papers that just came out. And documents that say the surge and whatnot was probably not going to do the trick, not going to work. In fact, things are not going well there. And he answers it frankly and says, yeah, if I had my druthers, I couldn't say so at the time. And that's an astonishing thing to think of, considering he is taking such a beating in his popular ratings. And to ask your students, should he be? And I think some might say yes, some might say no. And there's the Afghanistan papers there from the Washington Post. And of course, if you're in US history, the comparison to the Pentagon papers is just enormous. We have, speaking of teaching with primary sources, Jeremy, I know some of your stuff from the Library of Congress. David, this was a grant from the Library of Congress, Teaching with Primary Sources, website that NewsHour Extra created called Journalism in Action. It's on the history of journalism in America. And one of the case studies is on the Vietnam War. And we have a clip from Daniel Ellsberg. It's an audio clip. I'm not going to play it now, but again, it's right there to play for your students. All of the links are there. They're ready to go. Saying, she's like, why? the reporter's like, what? A lot of people, Vietnam wasn't going well. And so why were they so angry with you? If the government, it came out, knew that the war wasn't going well. And they knew that years before, similar to Afghanistan and in the Afghanistan papers. And he's like, presidents up until that time hadn't at least been busted or believed to this degree that they could lie to the American public. And he says it, and he was a believer at the time, guys. He was working with the government and believed in what he was doing. And then he sort of, he had an about face, a 180 some time later. That's a powerful thing, because now he's like, this is in the 70s or after Watergate. And he's like, and now people, if you say the president, well, he lied about that, no one is really shocked, but that was shocking. And so I think to your students, having a discussion about the values of our leaders, of our president, of our politicians, if they're being honest or not, is something that could, of course, really ignite students. You need to tell me to stop talking, David, at any moment. The slides are all here, so just feel free to interrupt.
So Vicki, I think if you've got about 5 minutes, and then we'll leave a handful of minutes for questions for folks.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So the teachers on here, either you're doing some amazing things around 9/11 or you're wanting to, and maybe some of this looks good to you. I tried to put in a hodgepodge of stuff because of different grade levels and different where you are in the country. That makes a big difference. But this is from the Washington Post recently. Arakaga said her son asked his social studies teacher if their class would be talking about the war's end. This is a recent article. And the teacher indicated that he hadn't been following the news. People should care, she said, and they're not even teaching it in school. Now, her husband, the young boy's father, was killed 10 years ago in Afghanistan. And obviously, none of us wants to be that teacher. because that teacher is reading this article in the Washington Post and thinking, okay, yeah. And, but he or she's not the only one. And so why is that the case? And how can we talk about this and teach about this event in a way that feels right to the teacher? So one way I went over the geopolitical history and the timelines you can give. The other way is to go the narrative route, to go the personal story route. So the story that we did with student voices are how the September 11th babies, folks born on that day, there were 13,000 little boys and girls born on that day in America, and how they're voting. And I just recommend it. Again, I'm not gonna show you that, oops, I hope it doesn't play. I didn't mean for it to play. No, sorry guys. Okay, but here's like a sample. In the back of my mind, I'd sit in class and I'd be like, all right, well, if something happens, how am I going to escape? What am I going to do? Am I gonna hide, jump out the window? She's not talking about 9/11. She's talking about school shootings, because with the political reporter, that's what came up with the dozens of kids that he spoke with. So yes, they don't know much about 9/11. They grew up with war in the background. Now, there was no draft. It's quite a different situation than other wars, but it was just always there. And what they do all remember and said to him was they remember Newtown, when 26, little tots, little boys and girls died. And so the violence going on all over the world is not lost on our American children, because they in fact go through a different kind of violence, and that's their fear of even when they're in school, which is supposed to be the safest place. This young woman, that's when I first realized that I was born on the worst day, and her story is incredible. Your students would love it, I think. Preview everything, obviously. But I'd say write down 5 thoughts about 9/11, like these kids did here, and have them share one of their ideas with the class, similar to Adsel did here. She talks about how Gen Z is actually more optimistic, because things have been so bad that they are looking forward. And I thought, wow, that's neat. Pick the one and then out of the 5 and share it with your classmates or parent share. All right, so Student Voice. Student Reporting Labs is our youth journalism program. They have a call out for your students to make short videos of their understanding of 9/11. And this is something you all could do. They tell you how to do it. Record horizontally on your phone. Some of these will end up going on the National News Hour broadcast with Judy Woodruff. And it's a very powerful way to process what your students are thinking. And maybe you'll be surprised by some stuff. But the prompt is, how are students today learning about the September 11th attacks and the world events that resulted? And we have educator voice opportunities. Again, I know there are teachers here. Annie Toms taught at Stuyvesant, which, was right there, right near, World Trade. Her students then interviewed all the students and custodians and teachers in their school, and they wrote a play. That play was then made into a book. Some of the poetry from that play appeared on the News Hour, and it could be something that you might consider asking your kids to do. If you feel like writing a post about this time, please feel free to send me your thoughts. Rasul here wrote, as a Canadian Muslim woman, an educator, about Islamophobia. That piece was a couple years old. It still very much applies. And I'll just end on, I lost a good friend on 9/11, Amy O'Doherty. There were 12 people from my town who died. I remembered the sirens going by. And I just think whatever story that is, that personal, Scott and Lisa, you in Brooklyn, who saw the second plane go in, you guys are in such a special, special place. So use those stories. And for those of you who might not be there, you have sites like Retro Report And, I hope good quality news organizations like the NewsHour. So thank you, David, and thank you, Jeremy, and all of you for being here.
Yeah, thank you. And if you just want to leave that, just going to tell you, leave that slide up. I can do it. I'll share my screen here. Just for folks, if it helps here, to grab our contact information. And I will say, Vicki, that one of the things I love best about the work that you do at NewsHour Extra is seeking student and teacher voice over and over and over. It's one of the few organizations out there that really is proactively out there trying to get more folks to speak out and to share their stories on a whole wide variety of issues. And there aren't too many news outlets, national news outlets, that are putting the voice of students front and center. So I think that's one of the really amazing things that with the work that you do. So we have a couple minutes for questions. If you have a question and want to pop it in the chat, great. If you want to unmute yourself, also great. And we do, we've got a survey that we put in the chat there. I will also send you in an email the link to that as well. What questions do you have, folks? What can we answer for you? Yeah, Kimberly.
I always feel like the biggest neglected piece of any history instruction is the role geography plays. Mm-hmm. And especially the geography of Afghanistan was so relevant to why the Soviet Union wanted it, why we want to control it. So what are some resources for geography instruction?
That is a great question. Jeremy, in some of your resource sets, were there any areas that focused on geography? You're muted though.
Too quick. We've got some historic ones. I mean, I think one of the things that's always fascinating with Afghanistan or other parts of, if you go more into the Middle East, is looking historically at, Sykes-Picot Act and some of the maps that were created post World War I and as part of imperial things, and then tying that to some of the present day sort of issues around Afghanistan itself. I'm trying to think, though, most of ours were historic maps that are in our sets. I'm trying to think if I've seen a good example of where that is today. And of course, the one interesting thing about today is, the only countries that the US could go in and out of were like Kyrgyzstan, in an old Soviet republic, basically, to get in and out. And because you've got Pakistan to the east, and so it's a very complicated section, Iran to the south. So I haven't seen anything that would get into that, but I think that's a great idea. And I think, to me, I always try to overlay historic maps from different eras, so Soviet era, previous eras in terms of empires and Western colonialism, and then look at where those lines are today and where some of those issues crop up as sort of an introduction. That's what I used to do with my middle school kids.
Yeah, I think one of the more interesting ideas there would be topographical maps. So I just popped one in the chat there for Afghanistan, but I think that was, in my experience, one of the hardest things to get students to understand is, like, if we've got an army there, why? And we're advancing. How is this so difficult to take out a poorly funded, lesser trained, smaller numbered group of forces? Well, to understand that, you really do have to understand the topography. You have to understand the mountains, the hills, the caves, all of those sorts of things. So that's a really great point. Other questions that we might be able to address for folks? All right. Before you leave, we've got a couple post-game questions. So now that you've been with us here for the last hour or so, I'd love to know how confident you feel now. Do you plan on incorporating some of these? And this is all anonymous, so don't worry. We won't come at you if you say, maybe these weren't for me. But we'd love to know and to get your feedback here. Look at this. Ask and you shall receive. We got people answering the polls. All right. We'll take a look at what folks said here. You guys can see this, correct? Excellent. So it does look like we got a lot of people who are eager to go do some exploring. And so here's the last thing I'll leave you with tonight. So first of all, thank you so much to all of the educators who came to join us. Thank you to Vicki and Jeremy who came to share their wonderful resources with us. You will be hearing from me soon. So tomorrow morning, I will have an email out to you that has this full presentation, that has the links to all of the resources that we talked about tonight, as well as a link to get a little bit more feedback from you. So as I said, I'm relatively new in my role, and one of the things I would love is feedback to know, is this something that Retro Report ought to do on a more regular basis? And what ways can we make it better? So I'm here to serve teachers and to, try to make your life easier. I know that's Vicki's goal. I mean, Jeremy, his main goal is to prepare future teachers, but also to do some wonderful work in creating new resources for classrooms. So Vicki, Jeremy, any parting words for us this evening?
No, I just love that there's so much, there's all of you guys are aware that, like, you do what works for your kids, and sometimes it's exciting to try something new, and sometimes it bombs. I had a couple 9/11 lessons that bombed, and I still remember them because the topic is so sensitive. But I learned from them. So and I guess I'm glad that I did them. And then I improved the next year. So thank you for teaching this topic, and thank you guys for a really wonderful and important discussion.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Have a nice night, everyone.